Maria Henderson was 73 years old when her grandson, David, graduated from the West Point Military Academy. She sat in the last row of the stadium, wearing a simple navy blue dress and a straw hat that shielded her face from the May sun. Around her, entire families celebrated with colorful signs, shouts of joy, and cameras that never stopped clicking. Maria watched everything in silence, her hands clasped in her lap and a small smile on her lips. No one paid attention to her. No one imagined who she really was. The ceremony began with the entrance of the cadets, all impeccably dressed in their white uniforms. David was in the third row, and Maria immediately recognized him by the way he held his shoulders straight, exactly as she had taught him when he was a child. She remembered when he was only 5 years old, playing with toy soldiers in the living room of their home in a small Kansas town. He always said he would be a real soldier someday. Maria never doubted it. While the Academy's dean was speaking about honor, courage, and sacrifice, Maria closed her eyes for a moment and traveled back in time. She saw herself at 22 years old in 1974 on a military base in Vietnam. At that time, Maria was not a grandmother. She was Sergeant Henderson, one of the few women serving on the front lines as a combat nurse. Her days were endless, filled with helicopters arriving with wounded soldiers, cries of pain echoing through the makeshift corridors, blood staining her uniform even after being washed dozens of times. She remembered the suffocating heat of the jungle, the dampness clinging to her skin, and the smell of wet earth mixed with gunpowder. Maria worked in a mobile combat surgery unit, where every second meant the difference between life and death. There were nights when she didn't sleep, just moved from one stretcher to another, holding the hands of soldiers who called for their mothers, promising them they would be all right even when she knew it wasn't true. One day in June of 1975, a mortar attack struck the base where Maria was serving. She was inside a triage tent when the first explosion shook the ground. Without hesitation, Maria ran outside and saw 3 wounded soldiers lying a few meters away. The bombardment continued, and everyone else had run for cover. Maria looked at the men on the ground, heard their groans of pain, and made her decision. She ran toward them as explosions raged around her, dragging them, one by one, to the safety of the medical tent. On the third rescue, shrapnel hit her left leg, but she didn't stop. She supported the last soldier and carried him inside before collapsing from pain and exhaustion. Maria woke up 2 days later in a military hospital in Da Nang. Her leg had been operated on, and she had metal fragments lodged near her thigh that the doctors decided not to remove because it was too risky. They said she was lucky to be alive. They said she was a hero, but Maria didn't feel that way. She had simply done what anyone should do, save lives when it was possible. She received the Silver Star for bravery, one of the most important decorations in the American Army. The ceremony was quick, at a military base, without much fanfare. Maria kept the medal in a box and never spoke of it again. When she returned home to Kansas, she simply resumed her life. She worked as a nurse in a local hospital for 35 years, married John Henderson, a kind man who worked on a farm, and they raised 2 children. John knew about Maria's military past, but respected her silence on the subject. She never talked about the war, about the things she had seen or done. Her children grew up hearing only vaguely that their mother had served in Vietnam. They knew she had a medal tucked away somewhere, but Maria never showed it. To them, she was just the mother who made pancakes on Sundays, sewed their school uniforms, and never missed a school performance. When John died of cancer 10 years ago, Maria continued living alone in her small house, tending her garden and visiting her grandchildren whenever she could. David was the eldest of the grandchildren, and he always had a special connection with Maria. When he told her he wanted to enlist in the army, Maria felt a pang in her chest. She knew what it meant to wear the uniform, the weight of the responsibility, and the price that was sometimes exacted. But she also knew she couldn't stop him. Instead, she supported him, writing him letters throughout his time at the academy, sending packages of homemade cookies and words of encouragement. The rector's voice pulled Maria from her reverie. He was announcing that a retired general would be giving a special speech. The man who stepped onto the stage had gray hair and wore his metal-covered uniform. It was General Thomas Garrett, a respected figure who had served in several wars and now held a senior position at the Pentagon. The crowd applauded respectfully as he positioned himself before the microphone. General Garrett began his speech by talking about the meaning of serving the nation, about the legacy of those who came before, and about the responsibility of the new generation of officers. His voice was firm and inspiring. Then he paused and said something that silenced the entire crowd. He said that on that day, there was someone special among them, someone who represented the true spirit of military service, someone who had risked his own life to save others, and who had never sought recognition for it. Maria felt her heart race. She looked around, confused, as the general continued speaking. He mentioned Vietnam. He mentioned a combat nurse who had saved 3 soldiers under enemy fire. He mentioned the Silver Star. Maria felt the blood rush to her face. It couldn't be. How did he know? The general then asked Sergeant Maria Henderson to stand up. For a moment, Maria stood paralyzed. Thousands of eyes turned toward the stands, searching for her. The people around her began to whisper, wondering who this woman was. Maria took a deep breath and slowly stood up. Her legs trembled slightly, not only from age, but from surprise and emotion. The general located her, and even from a distance, gave her a perfect, prolonged salute. The crowd erupted in applause. People began to stand, one by one, until everyone in the stadium was on their feet, applauding the 73-year-old woman at the back of the stands. David, down there, among the cadets, had tears streaming down his face. He had never heard the whole story. His grandmother had never told it. When the applause finally subsided and Maria sat down again, she was trembling. A woman beside her, who moments before hadn't even noticed her presence, held her hand and said with teary eyes that it was an honor to be sitting next to her. Maria simply nodded, unsure what to say. She had never sought this kind of attention. For her, what she had done in Vietnam was simply her duty, nothing more. After the ceremony, when the cadets were finally released to reunite with their families, David ran towards his grandmother. He hugged her so tightly that Maria almost lost her balance. He was openly crying now, not caring who saw. He said he was so proud of her, that he couldn't believe she had never told him about what she had done. Maria held her grandson's face in her hands and said in a soft voice that there was nothing to tell, that she had only done what was right. But David insisted. He wanted to know everything. So, as they walked through the academy gardens, Maria began to tell her story. She spoke of the endless days in Vietnam, of the soldiers she had treated, of the letters she received from families thanking her for saving their children. She spoke of the fear she felt every night, of the nightmares she had for years after returning home, of how John helped her through those difficult times. David listened in silence, absorbing every word. He had never imagined that his grandmother, the woman who made apple pies and always had a kind smile, had lived through all that. He asked why she had never spoken about it before. Maria stopped walking and looked at the horizon for a moment before answering. She said that for her, talking about the war always felt like bragging, and she didn't want that. She had done what she had to do, and then she went home and lived her life. She didn't think her past defined who she was. But now, seeing David in his uniform, about to begin his own military career, Maria realized that perhaps her story could mean something to him. She said she wanted him to understand that being a soldier wasn't just about battles and glory. It was about caring for the people around you, about making difficult choices when everything around you was falling apart, about finding strength even when you were afraid. The days following David's graduation were intense. Maria's story somehow reached the local press, and soon, reporters were knocking on her door, wanting to interview her. Maria refused most requests, but eventually agreed to speak with a small community newspaper because the reporter was the son of a veteran and was very respectful. In the interview, she kept her answers short and direct, reiterating that she was not a hero, just a woman who had done her job. But for the people who read that interview, Maria was much more than that. She represented a generation of veterans who had served quietly, who never sought the spotlight, who simply returned home and continued their lives. Letters began to arrive from veterans all over the country, thanking her for her service and for being an example of humility and courage. One letter in particular touched Maria's heart. It was from a man named Robert Chen, now 70 years old and living in California. He wrote that he had been on one of the stretchers Maria had rescued that day in 1975. He said he had never forgotten the nurse who dragged him to safety while explosions raged around them, the woman who held his hand while he was operated on, who whispered words of comfort when he thought he was going to die. He said he had spent the last 50 years living a full life, married, had 3 children and 5 grandchildren, and all of this was possible because Maria had saved him that day. He ended the letter by saying that she was his heroine, whether she wanted to believe it or not. Maria read that letter several times, always with tears in her eyes. She had kept the memory of that day locked in her mind for so long that sometimes it seemed unreal, as if it had happened to someone else. But Robert's letter made it all real again. She remembered his face, young and frightened, screaming in pain as she pulled him across the muddy floor. She remembered holding his hand on the operating table, promising he would be all right. And now, 50 years later, she knew she had kept that promise. Maria decided to reply to the letter. She wrote to Robert saying how happy she was to know that he had lived such a beautiful life. She said that thinking about him and the other men she had helped over the years was what made everything she had gone through worthwhile. She asked him to send photos of his family, and Robert sent not only photos but also called her. They talked for over an hour, sharing memories and laughing at little things. They became friends, keeping in regular contact after that. Meanwhile, David began his career as a second lieutenant. Maria worried about him, as any grandmother would, but she also knew he was prepared. He called her every week, always asking for advice and sharing his experiences. Maria listened attentively and offered her words of wisdom, based on decades of life and lessons learned the hard way. A year after graduation, David was assigned to serve overseas. Maria felt her heart tighten when he told her, but she didn't let it show. She prepared a package for him, including letters to be opened in difficult times, family photos, and for the first time in 50 years, she included her silver star. She wrote a note explaining that she wanted him to carry it with him, as a reminder that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to do what is right despite it. David was speechless when he opened the package and saw the medal. He knew how much it meant to his grandmother. He called her immediately and said he couldn't accept something so important. But Maria was firm. She said the medal had served its purpose for her, but now it could serve a greater purpose with him. She said she wanted him to wear it for protection, as a symbol that she would always be with him, no matter where he was. The following months were challenging for Maria. She constantly worried about David, obsessively checked the news, and prayed every night for his safety. But she also found comfort in her conversations with Robert and other veterans who had reached out to her. She realized there was a whole community of people who understood what she had been through, who shared her experiences and her fears. Maria also began visiting local schools at the request of teachers who wanted her to talk about her experience in Vietnam. At first, she was nervous and uncertain, but she found that the young people were genuinely interested in hearing her story. She didn't glorify the war, but spoke honestly about the cost of service, the importance of caring for one another, and how to find purpose even in the most difficult circumstances. There was one girl in particular, a 15-year-old named Sarah, who approached Maria after one of her lectures. Sarah said that her older brother was thinking about enlisting in the army, but their parents were against it because they were afraid. Sarah asked Maria if she thought he should go. Maria thought carefully before answering. She said that serving was a deeply personal choice, and that there was both honor and sacrifice involved. She said that if Sarah's brother felt a calling to serve, then he should follow that calling, but he should also understand what he was undertaking. Sarah thanked her and said she would share those words with her family. Months later, Maria received a letter from Sarah saying that her brother had decided to enlist and was in basic training. Sarah said he was inspired by Maria's story and wanted to serve with the same integrity and courage she had shown. Stories like these filled Maria's heart with gratitude. She had never imagined that her experience could impact other people in this way. She had always thought of her service as something private, something that belonged only to her and the men and women she had served with. But now she saw that sharing her story could inspire others, could help people understand the true meaning of sacrifice and service. 2 years after David's graduation, he returned home. Maria was waiting for him at the airport, holding a small sign with his name on it. When she saw him walking through the gate, thinner and with a more serious look in his eyes, she ran to hug him. David lifted her off the ground, laughing and crying at the same time. He said that the silver star had stayed with him every day, that he touched it whenever he needed courage, that it had kept him strong during the most difficult times. They went home together, and David spent weeks recounting his experiences. Maria listened to everything, offering comfort when needed and laughing with him at the lighter stories. She saw in him the same determination and sense of duty that she had carried all those years. She felt proud, but also relieved to have him back safe and sound. Maria Henderson continued living her quiet life in Kansas, but now with a newfound awareness of the impact her story had on people. She never sought fame or recognition, but accepted that her example could make a difference. She continued visiting schools, answering letters from veterans, and staying in touch with people who had been touched by her story. And every night, before going to sleep, Maria would look at the photo of David in his uniform, at the letters from Robert and the other men she had helped, and she would feel a profound peace. She had lived a life of service, sacrifice, and silence. But now, in the twilight of her years, she understood that her story wasn't just hers. It was a story of all those who serve, who make difficult choices, and who keep going, even when the world isn't paying attention. In the years that followed, Maria discovered a different rhythm in her life. Her Kansas home, which for so many years had been just a quiet refuge, transformed into a meeting point for veterans from the region. Every first Saturday of the month, a small group gathered in her living room for coffee and to share stories. They were men and women of different generations, some who had served in Vietnam like her, others who had been in Iraq, Afghanistan, or on peacekeeping missions around the world. They sat in Maria's worn chairs, drank strong coffee, and found comfort in being among people who understood them. Maria never planned for these meetings to happen. It all started when a local veteran named Marcus Williams knocked on her door a few months after her story was published in the newspaper. Marcus was 45 years old and had served in the First Gulf War. He said he was having trouble sleeping, that the memories were coming back every night, and that his wife didn't understand why he woke up screaming. He heard about Maria and thought maybe she could help. Maria invited him in and made coffee. They talked for 3 hours that first afternoon. Maria didn't offer easy solutions or empty words of comfort. Instead, she shared her own struggles, the years of nightmares she had after returning from Vietnam, the nights John found her awake in the kitchen at 3 a.m, trembling and sweating. She told how it took her years to learn to live with the memories, how she found ways to honor what she had lived through without letting it consume her. Marcus returned the following week, and then brought a friend. Soon, there were 5 people, then 10. Maria never turned it into anything formal or official. There were no rules, no agenda. People simply showed up, knowing they would find a safe space where they could be honest about their experiences without fear of judgment. Maria always had fresh coffee and some kind of homemade cake or biscuit. She didn't lead the conversations. She just let them flow naturally. There was a woman in the group, a 32-year veteran named Jennifer, who had served as a combat medic in Afghanistan. Jennifer rarely spoke at the early meetings, just sitting in the corner and listening. But one day, she began to cry silently as another veteran recounted losing a friend in combat. Maria approached and held her hand, without saying anything. After everyone else had left, Jennifer stayed. She told Maria that she had saved dozens of soldiers during her service, but there was one she couldn't save, a 19-year-old boy who had stepped on a mine and whose injuries were too severe. She held his hand as he died, promising she would tell his family he hadn't suffered, even though it was a lie. Jennifer carried the guilt of that moment every day, feeling she should have done more, that she should have been faster, more skillful. Maria listened to everything and then shared her own similar story. She spoke about a soldier she had lost during the Vietnam War, a young man she had tried to save for hours, but whose injuries were incompatible with life. She told Jennifer that she had carried that guilt for decades, until she finally understood that doing everything humanly possible sometimes simply wasn't enough, and that this wasn't a personal failing, but rather the tragic reality of war. Jennifer began to speak more in meetings after that day. She opened up about her experiences, and in doing so, slowly began to find peace. She wrote a letter to the family of the soldier she had lost, telling the truth about his last moments, about how brave he had been, about how she wished she could have done more. The family responded, thanking her for her honesty and for being there for their son when he needed her most. That exchange of letters brought Jennifer a relief she hadn't felt in years. David visited his grandmother whenever he could, usually showing up unexpectedly on weekends. He had been promoted to captain and was stationed at a base in Virginia. During one of these visits, he attended one of Maria's veterans' reunions. It was a powerful experience for him to hear the stories of people who had served in different times and places, but who all shared the same sense of duty and the same struggles to reintegrate into civilian life. After that meeting, David talked at length with Maria about his future. He was considering a career in the army, potentially for 20 or 30 years. but he also had doubts. He asked his grandmother if she thought it would be worthwhile. Maria chose her words carefully. She said that only he could answer that question, but that serving was both a privilege and a burden. She said that if he chose to continue, there would be sacrifices, difficult times, decisions that would haunt him, but there would also be purpose, camaraderie, and the satisfaction of knowing that he had dedicated his life to something greater than himself. David pondered those words for weeks. Finally, he decided to stay in the army. He called Maria to tell her his decision, and she said she would support whichever path he chose, but that she was proud of his determination and commitment. The years passed smoothly. Maria celebrated her 78th birthday, surrounded by family, friends, and veterans who had become like a second family. Her health remained reasonably good, although she felt more pain in the leg, where the shrapnel was still lodged, especially on cold days. She continued tending her garden, where she grew tomatoes, roses, and aromatic herbs. The garden was her place of meditation, where she processed her memories and found peace. One autumn afternoon, while Maria was watering her plants, she received an unexpected call. It was General Garrett, the same one who had recognized her at David's graduation years before. He explained that he was organizing a special ceremony at the Pentagon to honor combat nurses who had served in Vietnam, many of whom had never received proper recognition. He asked if Maria would be willing to participate and perhaps say a few words. Maria hesitated. She had never been comfortable being the center of attention, but the general explained that there would be other nurses there, women who, like her, had served quietly for decades. He said it was important for the nation to recognize their contributions, especially now that many of them were aging and their stories were at risk of being forgotten. Maria finally agreed, not for herself, but for the other women who deserved to be seen and honored. The ceremony took place on a clear November morning. Maria flew to Washington accompanied by David, who had requested special leave to be with her. When they arrived at the Pentagon, Maria was impressed by the grandeur of the place, but also intimidated. She wore a simple dark blue dress and had styled her gray hair in an elegant updo. On her chest, for the first time in decades, she wore her military decorations, including a replica of the Silver Star that David had insisted on returning to her. The room was filled with high-ranking officers, dignitaries, and families, but what caught Maria's attention most were the other 23 women seated in the front row, all Vietnam veterans, all combat nurses. They were between 60 and 80 years old, and in their faces Maria saw reflections of her own journey, the same marks of difficult experiences, the same quiet dignity. During the ceremony, each nurse was called individually and received a special commendation of recognition. When it was Maria's turn, General Garrett read a summary of her service, detailing the incident in which she saved the 3 soldiers and mentioning the years she worked under extremely difficult conditions. He concluded by saying that Maria Henderson represented the best of military service, someone who put the lives of others above her own without hesitation. Maria went up on stage with trembling legs. She accepted the commendation, and when asked to speak, she remained silent for a moment, looking at all those people. Then, in a clear but emotional voice, she said that she was honored, but that she didn't feel different from any other nurse in that room, or from any soldier who had ever worn the uniform. She said that they had all done what was necessary because it was their duty, and that true honor lay in serving, not in the recognition that came afterward. She looked directly at the other nurses and said that they were her sisters in arms, that they shared a bond forged in the most extreme circumstances, and that it was a privilege to be there among them. Her words were met with a warm ovation, and when Maria stepped down from the stage, each of the other nurses embraced her, many of them crying. After the ceremony, there was a reception where Maria talked at length with the other women. They exchanged stories, laughed at unexpectedly funny memories, and cried over painful ones. Maria realized that, during all those years she had kept her experiences to herself, there were other women doing the same thing, carrying the same burdens in silence. Being there with them, sharing openly, was liberating in a way she hadn't anticipated. In the following months, Maria kept in touch with several of those nurses. They formed a small online group where they shared photos, stories, and mutual support. It was comforting to have people who truly understood, who didn't need explanations, who simply knew. Maria continued her monthly meetings with veterans at home, but now with a slightly different perspective. She was more open about her own vulnerabilities, more willing to admit that there were still difficult days. still nights when memories resurfaced. This encouraged others in the group to be equally honest, creating an even more authentic space for healing and support. On one of her birthdays, David surprised her with a special visit. He brought Robert Chen, the man Maria had saved in Vietnam. They had never met in person since that day in 1975. When Maria opened the door and saw Robert standing there, now a gray-haired man with a gentle smile, she was speechless. They hugged for a long time, both crying freely. They spent the entire day together, sharing meals, looking at old photos, and filling in the gaps of 50 years of life. Robert showed Maria pictures of his family, his children and grandchildren, and repeatedly said that each of them existed because of her. Maria, with tears in her eyes, said that seeing him there, happy and with such a rich life, made everything she had been through absolutely worthwhile. That visit deeply affected Maria. She had always wondered about the men she had saved, what had happened to them, whether they had lived good lives. Meeting Robert and seeing concrete evidence of the impact of her actions brought a sense of completeness she hadn't known she needed. Maria Henderson lived to be 84 years old. Her last years were peaceful, surrounded by love and gratitude. She continued to receive veterans in her home until she could no longer do so, and even then they would visit her, bringing flowers, food, and company. David was promoted to major and married a teacher named Elizabeth. They gave Maria 2 great-grandchildren, whom she adored beyond measure. When Maria finally passed away, it was quietly in her sleep, in her own bed, surrounded by family photos and the soft light of dawn streaming through the window. Her funeral was held in a small church in Kansas, but hundreds attended. Veterans of all ages traveled from across the country to pay their respects. General Garrett was there, as were the nurses she had met at the Pentagon ceremony, and Robert Chen with his entire family. David delivered the eulogy. He spoke of the grandmother he knew as a child, the kind woman who made pancakes and told stories, but he also spoke of the courageous soldier who saved lives under enemy fire, of the veteran who carried her experiences with dignity and silence for decades, and of the woman who finally allowed her story to inspire others. He concluded by saying that Maria Henderson never considered herself a heroine, but that to all those who knew her, especially those whose lives she saved or touched, she was exactly that. Maria was buried with full military honors. An honor guard fired a salute. A bugle sounded taps, and the flag that covered her coffin was ceremoniously folded and handed to David. On the gravestone, in addition to her name and dates, was engraved, Sergeant Maria Henderson, combat nurse, served with honor and humility. Her home was maintained by David, who transformed the room where the veterans gathered into a small memorial. There, he placed photos of Maria in her uniform, her medals, letters from people she had helped over the years, and a guest book where veterans could come and leave their messages. The support group that Maria had started continued to meet, now led by Jennifer, the young veteran who had found healing through the conversations in that room. The story of Maria Henderson has become part of the curriculum in several schools in the region, taught as an example of quiet service and genuine humility. Young students have learned that heroism doesn't always come with fanfare, that the bravest people are often those who simply do what needs to be done and then continue with their lives without fanfare. And so, although Mary has departed, her legacy remains, not in headlines or grand monuments, but in the hearts of those she saved, those she inspired, and those who learned through her that true character is revealed not in how we seek recognition, but in how we live our values every day. Seen or not, applauded or not, remembered or forgotten, we travel the world, but we are always true to ourselves and to the greater calling of serving others.